This is Monica Perez here with someone I'm sure you know from all of his podcasting work, from his great show on TNT, but his true gift is research. You know who I'm talking about, Johnny Vedmore. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, pleasure to be with you, Monica. Lovely I mean, I always look forward to speaking with you. Again, the same thing in response. I was talking to someone about you just a couple of days ago, and I was saying, you come at stories at a really jaunty angle that makes a lot of sense and allows you to find lots of information that hasn't been uncovered yet. And I always appreciate that sort of way of looking at research, looking at articles to try and looking at stories to try and find the hidden narrative. So I'm really looking forward to this episode. This will be interesting.
Me too. Thank you very much. And what I do, I think, approach this stuff with a more analytical bent. I'm kind of a math person, and I think a lot of broadcasters and writers and stuff are more like English people. So I bring a little something. But what you do, which I cannot figure out how to do, and I'm actually hoping to learn from you on this, is to how you get more information. I mean, you really get down there. And some of the things I was reading about your techniques is stuff that I'm like, is that real? Can you really do that? Or, and even I don't care if it's legal or not, but just I'm surprised at some of the things that you can actually uncover if you know what you're doing, and you do know what you're doing. And we were on the exact same page about how to approach this because I really want to know about the research. But as I was reading your work, every single article was just a rabbit hole inside a rabbit hole, and definitely seemed to reveal different techniques. And the information, you really answer questions like, who is they? This isn't it's not the first one I want to talk about, but one of them is the Welcome Five. They are really the who are they behind what you were, the global response to COVID, which is just such an interesting one. But the rabbit hole I fell in, then I was looking at the Eric Weinstein one, your data diving, the really interesting articles. But the one I was just immersed in is about Jeff Bezos. So this may even be the simplest one, but the idea was, I always thought his story was ridiculous. He actually said that he crafted the idea of starting this in a garage. And once I just took a list of the 10 richest American tech guys, and every single solitary one of them was 1 or 2 degrees away from really deep military intelligence. The only one I couldn't find that relationship to, you're not going to believe it, is Steve Jobs, only later to discover that his father was his biological father was a CIA agent in Syria. So even if, and I think this may be true for Bezos, and then I'll let you take it away, even if he had no contact with that guy, he might have been on the radar for the unique skills they're identifying. So it seems to me Zuckerberg, his mother was a psychiatrist. I know nothing about him, but he went to the Center for Talented Youth. He seems to have like an amazing memory. And in your article, you mentioned how Bezos had the reason he got this job at the place that really was the incubator for some of the really megalithic companies on the web, is that he had, a balance of skills. And I feel like his grandfather was in the Atomic Energy Board or whatever. His grandfather might have said, hey, this kid tests like uniquely. Let's plug him into the system. So I think there's a lot behind who becomes a creative person or whatever. But that's where my speculation research ended on Bezos, but you uncovered his Svengali, the D.E. Shaw and company. Where did you even start to think about this? What was your first thought? What did you want to figure out in the first place?
When I started off researching Jeff Bezos, and I mean, I start off with my research really, I don't know where I'm going to find the information from. So I start looking in like the earlier part of the history of people. That's why with like Schwab, with Gates, with other people. I go back in time, decades and decades, and start there and then work forward. I find it really important to have the correct starting point, the point where things seem to be like, okay, that's where the rubber meets the road, on this story. That's where you start off, and then you really like from there, if you find the right launch pad for your research for an article, it kind of like the momentum builds up by itself, and you're just basically going through each year. Then there has to be that sort of organizational structure to whatever research you do. So when I looked at Bezos first, I spent a lot of time doing what I do normally, which is going back through family history and seeing what I could find. And I got back to the 16 or 1700s in Norway, to Peder Pedersen.
Wow, that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't shock me. Yeah. So I see how you go through, in that regimented way. And if I were to stumble upon a snapshot of what you were looking at, I could identify the threads that you should pull on, but I don't really know how to pull on those threads. I mean, how do you go about investigating a person's parents' backstory in a time when not all that information even is digitized necessarily?
For that, to explain that, I'll skip on to another brief like example of an article, which is the Schwab family values. That was like being told, listen, no one knows about Schwab's ancestors. Nobody knows for sure who his family is. Loads of rumors. Oh, he was a leading Nazi general on the battlefield. All of these sort of things. False leads all over the place, but nothing real. Try and find something real. So given 6 weeks, sat down, went through every archive imaginable. There is nothing like hard work to be able to get to where you're going. So to discover who Schwab was, I had to discover, okay, he's brought up in Ravensburg. It seems like he's got connections with Swiss and German nationality. It's time to look into the newspaper archives in both Switzerland and Germany. That takes a bit of work itself to find the right archives, to find the right places. Look for legal documents. Look through in like I think it's called the Landstrecht or archive or something along those lines. It's a German archive which has lots of documents on, and so try and find clues within there. And what you're looking for is something which is gonna really just say, oh, that's it. I found the big piece of information. Go on.
What about the language barrier?
No, that's all just
you speak.
Yeah, I speak a bit of French. I understand it. I don't understand German, but a lot of it has to be just translation apps, and you're just like, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. You split your screen up.
When I've looked through archives of newspaper articles, and a lot of times it's really the equivalent of a microfiche. So what you're actually looking at is a photograph. And I know now, very recently, we have access to the kind of software, whatever, apps, whatever, that will actually read the words in a picture. But that's kind of new, and that can't be what you had.
No. All I'm doing, I mean, I am looking at those snapshots, and sometimes I am typing it into the translation.
But a lot of times it's already digitized.
Yeah. If a lot of the newspaper archives and things like that are not, I mean, the key, I think it's like the second source on Schwab family values is a brilliant court document from Germany, which talks about Eugen Schwab, Klaus Schwab's father, and it mentions Eugen Schwab and Urs Rainer Schwab, his brother, and his mother, Erika, formerly a Precht. That document was not searchable. I had to go through loads of esoteric thinking, in a sense, to try and get to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm in this archive. archive looking for evidence on this date of something that happened. I've seen like rumors of a court case here or court case there. I find the actual document, and the document nails officially who the father is. That's like, I like to see it like this. If I want to put something in an article, I've got to find 3 points of information to prove that. One has got to be solid, and two have got to be can be weaker. That's and that was the solid data to who his father was. From that point on, it's like blah, 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 blah. It unfolds really quickly, like just unwraps itself. And the same with Jeff Bezos. To understand where to start with Bezos, I had to understand where the story was. Sometimes the story is in the ancestry, and I think there is a lot there. Bezos was brought up by his stepdad. His relationship with his dad is unclear, and his stepdad is a very interesting character in himself.
I didn't even know that. Yeah, I was discovering
But
that.
then you could get distracted by that for a long period, looking through that sort of information. But really, what I wanted to say is, okay, I'm going to start off when Jeff Bezos is a young man. If he's recruited probably through something like a university or through a company when he's very young. So I'm looking through. I know his age. I know when he goes to university and when he starts working for certain companies. So I'm looking for any information during that period, and out of it, of course, comes the connections, the significant connect. I mean, he gets up to a definite vice president. At one point, he's acting president of D.E. Shaw, and D.E. Shaw was owned up to 5% plus of the New York Stock Exchange at the point. Wow. I mean, that's an enormous amount, and when you actually delve into what they were doing, like there was once you've got the connections, once you understand Jeff Bezos went and worked for this company, and once you realize the company's really important in the grand scheme of things, then I go back and learn about David Shaw and work my way forward, and soon I you can then enter and indulge. Like I say, blah 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 blah. That bit is really fun because that's the bit where you're looking through archives, where you're looking at New York Times articles or big mainstream media articles where they're talking about the inner workings of D.E. Shaw, and they're talking about this like weird. They're using sort of computerized game theory to map out like algorithms to map out the future and what the future looks like, and they're describing it as like in normal hedge funds and etc. You got people on the phone screaming, "Oh my God! I tell you, I gotta buy," and etc. Like doing this sort of stuff. With D. Shaw, it's silent. Everybody's sort of doing things quietly. People are away in pairs and they're strategizing together. But most importantly, one of the major points in that article where you can see D. Shaw directly is the story and where the story should go is. They were doing things that no one else would do. Not only do they have a lot of power, not only do they have a lot of influence, not only do they have a lot of money, but they were doing things in a completely different way. And when you see something that looks different than everything else, that becomes a story, because that's the sign that there's a problem, there's an issue there. And the main issue with D.E. Shaw, the thing that sparks that curiosity about the company, was that they were recruiting people not by their skill set and what they can do for the company, but by they weren't saying, "I'm going to recruit you for this assistant manager position focused in on AI or etc. etc." They were saying, "Let's recruit them and find the best place for them through their own skills and by examining their own qualities, and then we can harness that ability, that like the focus they've got." To really look at something and they'll already be motivated. It's a very clever way to employ, but it's very different than everybody else. And when you see anomalies like that, then you say, okay, that's your story. You start from there. Whatever you find afterwards is always interesting.
I have a lot to say. I'm going to make it very quick because I don't want to waste any time picking your brain. But that reminds me of something I stumbled upon looking into actually the origin of the net. And it was kind of dovetailing with Ted Kaczynski,
Mm-hmm.
where the guy who brainwashed him or MK Ultra'd him at Harvard actually got I think like a Congressional Medal of Honor for writing the assessment of men. Murray, I think his name was, maybe Henry Murray or something. He wrote the assessment of men. And I only stumbled upon that because I was looking into J.D. Vance and I was thinking they identified, it's like a similar thing. They identified him at some point and put him on this trajectory, including what I consider may have been an arranged marriage, which sounds like the Bezos thing. And I thought, well, when he joined up in the service, J.D. Vance, he probably, I think they all actually take, I think might even have been a Marine. They take those tests, those assessments. Now corporations do that as a regular thing. I don't know how high or low you have to be on the totem pole, but they do those assessments. You get assigned numbers. You're a 5 and a 2, 5 dominant, like stuff like that. It's common now. But then I can see they were actually accumulating that talent, maybe even hoarding it. It's possible that they were hoarding that kind of talent. And then you can say what you have to say, but I have to get back to my 2 things that are so interesting. Like you just pointed out that you read the New York Times articles and it tells you all this stuff. And I noticed that if you go deep enough, you find the information before the narrative changes. So like AOC, who's the congresswoman here, there was a change and I identified it. Like I connected it to a Jeopardy contestant. It's a long story, but it's like she somehow, like his crazy backstory, they gave it to her. And I will find it by reading articles about her before and after this guy became a star and the narrative changed. But the old articles are so interesting. Huawei is like that too. That used to be we're uncompetitive with their chips. Then that didn't work. And then they said they're a national security risk. And now that's the only narrative you hear. And I also want to talk about your sources. Go ahead.
Okay, so narrative, before the narrative change, think about that as a concept of someone's life. If I'm going to go and find information, there has to be information to find. And if the person hasn't done anything yet, there's going to be very limited information to find. But what is going to happen if they become rich and famous and they become powerful? You can go back to the 1980s and you can be reading stuff that was published in the late 90s or the noughties about Jeff Bezos. And you can be adapting that and putting it there and saying, oh, that is what we was doing in the 80s. But you're looking at the narrative change points. There's a big narrative change. 1993, 1994 is the point when Jeff Bezos' narrative changes. So any information before that period really has to be from that period, and you can't extrapolate from what's to come. But what you can use is you go to the you gather the information that was after that narrative change point, and you look at it and examine the trajectory and see if it makes sense. And what you find with Jeff Bezos is this narrative creation where suddenly he's again thinking it up. He's in his garage. He borrows some money off his family to buy a station wagon and loads it full of books at the back. And him and his future wife go out and they build a business. It's going to be the biggest bookshop in the world. It sounds comical, but there's book after book after book after book. Yeah, through the late 90s, from about probably like about 97, 98, 99, 2000 onwards, there's these different books that all create the same mythos about Amazon and Jeff Bezos, and they are printed one after another, and of course they're sold on Amazon and they're promoted by Amazon. So everybody thinks they know the birth of Jeff Bezos, but what they know is the narrative that was created. And then you compare that narrative to the trajectory that he was on at D.E. Shaw, and it does not make sense. You can't be a vice president of one of the biggest hedge funds in the world and then need a station wagon you buy off your family and load it up with books. That does not work. It does not make sense. So you have to analyze it all, and when you do, you realize, of course, you can see where all the holes are and you can see where the story is.
That does remind me of both the Vance and the AOC stories, because Vance was this nobody, and he gets to the service and ultimately he goes to Yale, which is really hard to get into. And he meets Thiel and gets his first job from Thiel, his second job from Thiel, never shows up at the office. Like, it doesn't make sense. He's and then Ron Howard makes a movie about his life. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. So, and AOC is similar. She did a TED talk. She worked for Ted Kennedy, but the message was that she was a craft cocktail. And it's funny because I want to get her in a room and just ask her one question, and I think the whole thing will unravel. And the question would be, what's the difference between a sour and a flip? And then she would not. It's a cocktail question. So she wouldn't know because she was supposed to make cocktail.
Hey, I didn't know because I've never made cocktails. So there you go.
So a flip is a whole egg and a sour is just the egg white. But real aficionado of craft cocktails would know that because there's different.
I'm gonna have to ask my housemate when he gets back.
See if he knows. If he's trained, he should know that.
Oh, he's pretty trained. He should bloody know that. We'll see. I'll make fun of him if he doesn't.
I always find, like, when I'm on a show and I think somebody's a little bit off, I like to ask a little question like that. And I'll never like go, ha, ha, ha. No, I'll never, ever do that. But I'll just hear it.
Important.
Yeah.
Important to know as an investigator, and if we're giving advice to other investigators, those moments you cannot let them pass if they arise. You must know the question that you want to ask, and there's almost every sort of there's lots of different people I've met who or I've talked to along the way who I want to ask a specific question to. Some I've not managed to, and others, like with the second Stanley Pottinger article that I wrote, there was a point where Rudy Giuliani was quoted. I thought there was never going to be a chance where I was going to be able to ask Rudy Giuliani a question, and then I was on an X space on the Epstein files. They've given me central space. Giuliani comes on, and I'm able to ask him directly about why they did not indict Stanley Pottinger over Iran-Contra when he himself said that the evidence showed that Stanley Pottinger was central to Iran-Contra, and he was like, "Oh, I don't remember that at all."
Oh,
he was the one who was doing it. So you have to you have to have that one focus in your mind. This is the thing about writing articles, is you've got your focus. Your focus is to get to the nub of it, to get to the real story underneath it. And for that, you need to constantly be aware of where the real questions are and what they are.
Yes, and part of that is kind of having a theory first, I think. But I just wanted to say one thing before we pass about the sources. You said you need 3 sources, a solid source, and a couple of things that kind of support that. That's not, that's actually the rule of thumb. When I know back in the day when I had a radio show, I knew somebody who did the TV news. Maybe it was somebody who's also doing the radio news, and the rule was you have to find the source has to be 3 other mainstream outlets, which is hilarious because if you actually try to source things from the mainstream outlet, you realize that they're just referencing each other. One of them supposedly has a source they're not going to tell you, and the other ones are just referring to that. So 3 mainstream sources to me is like one or none. And you're saying they have to be one has to be rock solid and the other can be supporting. That's actually a better way to do it.
Yeah, I much prefer there to be a source from the records, from legal archives, from right there, at the time, shining like a light, being like, oh, you got. When I discovered that the court case with Schwab, it was just like, oh, this 4 or 5 weeks of trudging through Swiss and German archives is just it was the right direction to go, and then it makes you realize, okay, now I can go on, now I can tell a story.
I'm looking at the Schwab article and I'm not seeing like a giant stack of sources. Do you share those sources? Where do you put that documentation?
Oh yeah, they're in this. They're underscored within the article. They're actually links. So
that's great. Yeah,
I make it so that it's as easy as possible if you and also so I can remember where they are. I mean, I think it's in the Schwab family values. I think it's the second source down that's the actual court case document. And for that as well, it's like you're saving it for time. You're saving it on the Internet Archives. Then you go to the sources separately and you save those on the archive.org, and you save those in picture format as well to make sure that you save them too. An important part is not just to come across the source because they can delink things, but it's to save the source in the archives somehow, or to make sure that you keep copies of them, so that when they realize you've got them, they will delete things. They do
Oh,
delete
yes.
things. So I mean, it's I try and I was arguing a petty argument with someone yesterday about Matt Taibbi, and I was saying that he doesn't, his people were saying, oh, his articles in the past are amazing, and I was saying, well, they're not. They source themselves, and there's like 3-4 sources in one of the articles that was given to me. I'll like my articles have 100+ sources in sometimes, and they're really solid sources. I really do think that's the fundamental underlying thing. You have to be able to back up what you say, and nothing I cannot find. If I can't find sources for something, it does not go in the article, however juicy it may be, however big a rumor it may be. And I've got loads for all of these articles. I've got loads of these different rumors and speculations. As soon as you start putting them in, the whole thing starts to lose credibility straight away. And if you live by that, and you live by the principle that it's got to be good evidence, then you'll always know that you can defend every article that you've written, and that's going to be important for the future.
That's amazing. And there's two things. So, yeah, I saw that you had everything was hot linked. And I used to before, I'm easily discouraged, I guess. I used to write lots and lots of articles. And then like I lost my website and I just never went back to it. But it was a pain I would link every single source, everything. My thing was like, two colors basically. And I remember thinking, why don't these huge media outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, I want to click through on these things. And the few things
Mm.
where you will click through, that's when I started realizing, because it's just a big circle and
Oh
their
yeah.
sources are almost always some anonymous talking head from inside the Pentagon. It's like, that's not
Mhm.
journalism. I mean, obviously it's Mockingbird, but it's actually it's even more difficult to do it the way it's much more time consuming, not compared to your other, all the research you're doing, but, to present it this way, it's really a service. And I'm sure we talked about this the first time you were on my show, but can you remind me how you developed these skills? Did you have a journalism background? I mean, I'm an
Mm.
autodidact myself, and so I could do it, but I'm not anywhere near as good as you. So this seems it's just so professional. But you are also self-taught?
I failed at my advanced GMVQ in leisure and tourism at college. I wanted to go to do a university course. So to be honest, the first thing I requested to do in college was history and English, which makes very it's sense to me now that's what I was interested in. But they refused to let me. They made me do an advanced GMVQ. It was a new type of qualification at the time, come out that year, and they were pushing it. So I ended up working in hotels for years and years, and as a night manager, and it gave me a lot of time to read newspapers. That's for sure. I used to get the newspapers in at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, and go through them as I was like marking them up to send them up to the rooms, etc. But no, the fact is that it came to a point where I realized I have to decide. I was dedicating my life to music for most of the time,
Right.
mainly
Yeah.
because I was addicted to drugs. Just like, I was in a band where we just would all get high and play music all day long, just the boys together. I mean, it was a terrible nerdy sort of life of a musician, but that was a really good outlet for me. And it taught me a load, because it taught me how to write structure. I'm a lyric writer. I love to write songs. I love intro. I love a verse, chorus, a middle eight, a solo, and maybe another chorus and then an outro. That's how I base my articles too. It's very much like a song. I have a first intro, a second intro, and then I have the bulk, the verse, the chorus, the verse, the chorus. That could be in the second Klaus Schwab article, Dr. Klaus Schwab, or how the CFR taught me to stop worrying and love the bomb. In that article, when I get into the bulk, the verse, chorus, it's about I go through the three mentors of Schwab. So you've got Henry Kissinger, Herman Kahn, and John Kenneth Galbraith. I think I mixed the way I've done them up. But each of them have got like a verse and a chorus to them, a verse and a chorus, and then you have like a solo, and then you have an outro, and you know it's very much based like a song. So I think songwriting helped massively, but journalistically I had to learn all of it myself. I'd already worked out that in my roaming around the internet, I had discovered techniques to find information no one else had discovered. And it was probably about 2013, 14, around then, to maybe a little bit earlier, where I was starting to get wrapped up with the Epstein case, which wasn't in the mainstream ether of social media that much then. And I started to realize that I already knew information that other people didn't know, and that I was actually ahead of what was being printed or published. And that made me think, oh, maybe I should look towards using this skill. And journalism, I mean, it was a mushroom hiatus that made me say I've got to go and do journalism now. And it kind of like the path was laid for me to go and do that. And then it's been like, you know, I've been learning it as I've been going along. Listen, everybody says it, you just got to do it. With anything, you've just got to do it. You can't ruminate about it all the time. You can't aspire to do it. If you really want to do it, you do it. So you start writing. Sometimes your writing's going to be really good. Sometimes it's going to be poor. And then eventually you learn how to do it. And you pick up all the skills and techniques. And you listen to other people. And you learn about things like logical fallacies. That was a really important part. To be perfectly honest, my journalistic career would have been that of opinion piece and being a social media influencer rather than a journalist if I hadn't understood logical fallacies and hadn't gone deep into what is the truth and what is a lie, and how do people twist the truth and how to spot it so that you can look for someone who's being deceptive, because deception is where the story lies.
That is so... Nice, excellent, very creative. Like your whole thing is that you're creative, and that would be the example. And I actually, when I started, you know, in thinking about podcasting and when I had radio, I was surprised at how creative it was, because I'm really not a creative, but it was a creative outlet, so it was exhilarating, like you say. I also remember people close to me wanted to, like, I had a producer who loved me, and she wanted me to not say what she called crazy things, because then I wouldn't grow, wouldn't have an audience. Yeah. But I had to say the thing. It was a struggle, because it was a call-in show, and I had to, and you had to be good. Like, you had to have a grab. You know, you had to have something that would get people engaged. And all I had going for me was I would crack the code. That's what I said, crack the code. And it made her nervous. We finally had to get the program director in and say, as long as you distinguish between what you know and what you think, you can say whatever you want. And it was really great. However, I was at a disadvantage. It was harder for me versus the other hosts, because all they were doing was appealing to the emotion, and their sources were just Wall Street Journal or Rush Limbaugh, and their audience wanted to hear it. Like, oh, Obama is a socialist, you know, and everyone would be like, oh yeah. And they'd call and say, Obama is a socialist. They didn't want to, it was much easier to do, but they did not recognize, they thought it was news, but really it was an engaging entertainment, but it was based entirely on emotion. And they would argue with me when I would have facts. They would say, that's not, I told them what was in that Iran deal, and they didn't want to hear it. The audience, they would call and argue with me, and I would read the words off of the page to them, did not want to hear it, but it made me recognize the difference.
There's a thing that we all do when we enter into journalism or anything like this. We suddenly have this idea, oh, we have to do the thing that we're used to and that we know very well. And we are in the alternative indie media, and lots of people try that very early. They try and act like the talking heads are on TV, because that's the natural mode that they go into. That's what they know. That's what they've been taught. That's what they think news looks like. And then you realize very quickly, oh, wait a minute, that's what the corporate news looks like. So if you're within the corporate arena, depending on the nuance in there, is depending on the conflict you get from inside it about editorial control, or what you can and can't say, or what you should and shouldn't say. But on the independent media, we got to be able to have our balls out. I mean, that's the best way to say it. We got to be able to say, oh no, we have to explore the things beyond what talking heads and trends dictate. And if you are reporting on whatever is trending, you will only you will look around and you will hear all of these voices, a cacophony of sounds, and it will all be mainstream, because that's what the mainstream does. It reports on trends over and over again, and you've got to leave what's trending behind. You've got to realize, okay, this is the question that needs to be answered. Ignore the rest of the shouting and the screaming, and you've got to look into that, and you'll find a story from looking at things differently.
I think at this stage of the media evolution, let's call it, that it's more, we've entered the realm where podcasters and alt media, independent media are not realizing that they're doing that very thing, but within their own echo chamber or whatever, within their own, I hate all of those words, ecosystem, whatever, but like they're people in our arena no longer fall for the mainstream thing, but this space is populated by either useful idiots or controlled opportunists, as Steve Boykin calls them. There's plenty of noise that gives you either, pushes you to there is a groundswell of things people want to hear. Like it was the Trump assassination. Everybody wanted to say that's the thing. And this North Carolina flood, I think that the spruce pine lithium, I don't know if you're following the story. There's this unique lithium in North Carolina that unique in the world, really, really critical. And that's where this giant hurricane came through and just wiped it out. There are people dying on those hills right now. I think that is what that's all about. However, I'm skeptical because that's what everybody else is talking about, even in our space. And I feel like I'm not taking anything for granted. I want to know more. And sometimes only time will tell.
You have got to remember not to follow the mainstream, because the mainstream will lead you down a road where you're looking at what everybody else is saying, what everybody else's opinions are, and opinions don't lead you to answers. Opinions will just lead you to you having more opinions. I tend to see my work as being like, when I write an article, I'll write a load of fact down, and then at the end of it, I'll give my opinion. Everybody seems to be giving their opinion first, and then waiting for the facts at the end. And I think that's what real journalism real journalism, that's what true journalism, I would say, looks like.
And I like that you give your opinion. I think that's gonzo journalism, right? Isn't that what the expression gonzo journalism means, that you actually have an opinion? I don't think you do that.
But
like, actually,
you also get involved. Gonzo journalism is like you get your nose right involved in it.
No, you're not doing that. No. So interesting. So another, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I didn't know this. And I'm sure people have referred, when I've asked these questions, people have referred to your work to me. Like, he cracked the code on Charles Schwab, Mencius Moldbug. I was like, that guy is definitely full of it. Like, oh, read Johnny Vedmore's article. I should always go to your stuff first. But obviously, it's not like you can write one of these every month. But I remember the whole being absolutely riveted by the Evergreen College, like all the videos that were taking place. Brett Weinstein, who is the dark horse or whatever, he and people like, wow, he's so great, even though he's liberal, he was mainstream, and they established, and I'm like, this just doesn't seem right. I don't know if you saw the videos that established Brett Weinstein's legacy. Are you familiar with this? Because you were
maybe not. Yeah, because listen, I went through like I had a period in probably about 2017, maybe it was 2016, 2017, 2018, where I started to get into the intellectual dark web right at its primordial sort of beginnings. I was loving Jordan B. Peterson. I watched his Bible lectures 3 times. I watched his lectures on like psychology in various universities over and over again. Very interesting information. Brett Weinstein seemed so he seemed intelligent but emotional. I liked his emotional content. He had an emotional value to stuff. Eric Weinstein, I didn't start to see until later, and he was the first person where I was like, okay, this intellectual dark web is sus. And I'd already written, if you go back to, I think it's on the Swamp Media or Vocal.media, it's like a platform where you can publish your own work. There's a slight bit where they check your spelling and then they put it up, basically for you, and then people can tip you on there. I was publishing on that at first because it was just completely independent for me to be able to do that, and it was before they floated it on the stock exchange. And I had actually written a piece which is like why you want to follow the intellectual dark web, but it was fairly positive. It was like, look,
Yeah,
these guys,
this.
they're saying the opposite to what a lot of you believe, and you want to know, you want to understand what's going on, what's really happening. So I really went in a bit deep with them. And what's interesting about, before you go on, what's interesting about this Eric Weinstein piece is that I had got to the point where I had started investigating them, discovering that each one of them had these little skeletons in their closets. And Eric Weinstein was a person who really triggered me. I watched his. I was going to work every day to this 2-star hotel I was working in, behind a reception desk, writing articles behind a reception desk in a one-man hotel. Yeah, it was an amazing gig to get in that sense.
Yeah.
And I was listening to the Ben Shapiro podcast every day when I was going up there to kind of like work out how he uses his arguments. So it's all whataboutism, of course. And then I was watching like people like Eric Weinstein talk, and I was just like, I do not trust this guy at all. There is something wrong. He's signal, something's wrong. And I started researching him back in about 2019, early 2020, and I discovered around then that he had actually, like before this hedge fund that he had worked for, he had worked for the UN and been involved in Edge when it was 100% funded by Jeffrey Epstein. But then my life went and I ended up like concentrating on other articles, moving over to South America, doing all this other stuff, being extremely distracted by life. And it took me, I watched Eric Weinstein throughout that whole time for years and years afterwards, knowing that I knew certain information about him, but not really investigating it, probably being like, okay, that's on a back burner. It like at some point I'll be so emoted by something that he says that I'll be like, okay, I'm going to go and have a little look about
definitely.
that.
Yeah, you can't go too soon.
And that happened recently. That happened recently. That was the moment. A moment was just like, oh, I said to, it was the amazing Polly. She was saying stuff about Brett and Eric. And I was like, oh, do you want to know something about Eric's that no one knows? And she was like, yes, I do. And so I went back and I went and looked back at that information I had found before. It's easy to kind of like remember where to go for these things. I remember he had a different site with a different name. And then going back to there, it was actually better that I had left it that number of years, because really, if you want trending factors, the idea of the Great Replacement was very important to the information that was on his website.
And nobody even heard of that kind of till recently. And I will say there's no shame in having gone along with that stuff or bought into that stuff back then. I mean, it seems like not that long ago. It's very long ago. It was 7 years ago. I only started even I didn't know 9/11 was an inside job until 2013. So I didn't know Alex Jones was an inside job until much later than that. So
it's funny though.
Yeah. Who knows?
It's a funny inside job.
Oh yeah, he's great. Like he provided he had to be so good to get where he got. Like I'll look back at some of his interviews that Ben Livingston, who was a pilot for Operation Popeye with the weather control. That was a really interesting interview he did. He did the Kay, what was her name? Like that was crazy. This wife of an insider. I forget who it was, but he did a lot of stuff that was super, super valuable because, as I always say, it's like the Rolling Stones and Tavistock. It's not going to work if it's not great. It has to be great. Rush Limbaugh had to be great. It's just not going to, Nirvana has to be great. It's just not going to stick if it's not the best of the best. And of course, that would explain, like Bezos, you don't always get the best of the best when they're scratching out lyrics in the sand on the beach. You might, it's a lot easier if someone hands you a stack of awesome songs like Jim Morrison. So I think that the evolution of insight and ability to, truth discernment, it takes time. But then I also think about the fact that they give us information. Like I cannot get my mind around that. Sometimes stuff is just out there. Okay, so the lithium thing in North Carolina, they probably knew that was going to come to light. So they allow it to just, flood the zone. And pretty soon you'll have a bunch of stupid stuff that isn't true that'll discredit people who just repeat it. But a lot, I think that they release information slowly into the world because they could just scrub the internet of everything, right? Why don't they? That's the question. Why don't they? How is it there for you?
You've got something like 7 to 12 major servers that if they shut them all down or if they were to blow up, we would not have the internet. And there is plans in the future to be able to change the internet. I think, the app sort of idea on phones and tablets allows them to be able to shovel people into a new style of selective internet where you don't get that sort of broad sort of access to knowledge that we've got in the current iteration of the internet. And I think they want to get us used to this idea that we get what we're given and we want to go and search this, or we have to buy this app and purchase this and do all of this. They don't want that freedom that exists online. So it's, I don't know. I think that the most important thing to remember, and this is in context to what we were just talking about there, a lot of these guys who are nefarious, a lot of these guys who are manipulating us in all different ways, they're doing it and they're controlling information. They're the center points for information control. They're the funnel that they will give us. They will censor as much above. Yeah, they will censor enough above, so you end up with just a laser focus of information hitting you in the head, and you will follow people like Brand or Jones or others or either one of the Weinsteins to get that information. And what you've got to remember is, hey, once you've realized the source is dodgy, doesn't mean you should stop listening to the source. That's when you should listen even more, because that's when you know what they want you to think. That's when you can define what they tell you which is true and what they tell you which is false. It's actually once you've rumbled the source or you don't trust it anymore, that's when you should analyze it the most. That was one of the key. When I said I was listening to Ben Shapiro every day walking, I hated Ben Shapiro. Everything about him went right through me. Eh?
You were hate listening to Ben Shapiro?
Yeah, I know, but I was walking to work going, oh, yeah, bastard. Oh, and I was really angry about some of the things he was saying. But it wasn't like...
You didn't hate him.
No. What I was doing was I was listening to the words he was using, the arguments he was making, the logical reasoning he was using. I was trying to understand what type of logical fallacies he uses. It's 96% whataboutism with Ben Shapiro. He's like, he's always, if you think this is bad, what about this over here? But he's not saying what about, because he only argued with children. So you can start to see, there's a process where you start to work out how these arguments are built, you start to understand how they manipulate you, so that when you listen to someone else, then you can hear the same arguments being made and the same way of manipulating. Now, some people just use logical fallacies. They don't have the logical mind to be able to work things out without logical fallacies. They've been given those logical fallacies through schooling, through life in general, so they believe that means, oh, I can think of something that way, I think of it relatively, and so that means it's true, where it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So you start to learn, and you see how people wield logical fallacies. So I was examining Ben Shapiro's use of logical fallacies, but at the same time, I did not like him. I'm listening to him, not liking him, but I'm trying as well learn how to be, and this is the most important thing, objective. I'm trying to learn how to get rid of that initial hate for the character and for the person, and listen to their arguments and listen to what they say, so I don't get riled up, emotional, and I can actually argue against people who are using logical fallacies.
That is funny that I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh to do the opposite. So like, how do I just get people to call? Like, how do I attach their emotions? That's what they told me in the radio. They're like, you have to talk about what they already know and what they already have feelings about and opinions about, so that they will call. And it was hard. It was hard to do. And if I didn't do that, I had to come up with 3 hours. He said I didn't have to do it. He didn't tell me I had to do it. But if you didn't, I had to come up with 3 hours of live radio to people who, I didn't know how far off the rails. I couldn't see the look of horror on their faces if they weren't calling in. So it was, for me, I was kind of trying to do the opposite, but that also demonstrates that the opposite is what actually gets listeners. That's what gets people engaged. The more intellectual it is, the much smaller your audience is. And I don't necessarily blame people. I mean, it takes a lot of time to read and to find, and how are they going to find you, a mainstream person? It's unlikely. So I see that your data diving, is that what it was? Data diving part one. That's
that
5 years ago. Yeah, that's a long time ago. But that just blew me away. I mean, can you just tell the story of it? Like, where was your first thought on that? How did you have the courage to do it? What techniques? can't even follow. Tell me about that. What is it? Just off the top, what were you doing? What's it about?
Go back in time to about 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. And if you wanted to illegally download videos or music, which we all did, I mean, everybody had the CDs full of music, and they slowly turned from making CDs that are full albums to MP3s loaded up on CDs, so you've got loads and loads. You want the full catalog for everything. You'd go to back in the day, it was like Kazaa, K++, it was LimeWire, it was these sort of peer-to-peer platforms where people shared this information. And whenever I was on those back in the day, and we'd be searching around and looking for all sorts, because you could find loads of really weird things. I remember, and this was kind of like one of the points where like the idea of this first spawned, and I can't remember how I was living with a French girl called Nell, and we were downloading like family. It was about 2005, 2006, and we were downloading like loads of Family Guys and loads of movies and stuff, and watching them like like you do when you like something. And what would come on these peer-to-peer platforms? You could search browse the user, and see what's on their computer. And sometimes you found like you'd find someone who's into the same style of music as you. You search their browser, you get a load of albums, a load of movies, and you just download all of their albums and movies. And back then, that's what it was used for. Now, later on, the world of Netflix and etc. and all of these things took over. And I was it was about 2018, 2019, roughly around there, where I was like, I'd been thinking for ages, how can I go and find people doing really nefarious stuff, including, sharing illicit shit without seeing anything? So that was really important. I didn't want to I wanted to go, because I was on a thing. I had been groomed when I was young. So when I was between 9 and 11, I was groomed by a prolific paedophile. He got very close to my family, and it was a really terrible. I went to court. It turned out he had molested a kid during that period, and I spent years feeling very guilty for the fact that a 3-year-old had been molested when I didn't tell my parents about something between the age of 9 and 11.
So
And yeah. I've gone through sort of like, years of trying to. Again, it was mushrooms that helped me get over that trauma in
instant
to that
therapy.
sense.
Yeah, instant.
Yeah. I had to really. There was a lot of crying involved in that. I had to talk to myself as a child and stuff, and really understand. So I went into this world where, by the time I got up to about 2017, 18, I was like, okay, how can I find a way to do what lots of people were doing online? Was like this really like upfront sort of version of it. They'd be grooming a pedophile to meet them in public, and then they would be jumping them like we see on X and stuff. That wasn't my style, but I wanted to make a dent. So I thought, wait a minute, well, I used to use peer-to-peer platform, and every now and again you'd be going through an album, and so you'd see a horrible looking video name, and you'd like go, oh god. And then I realized, well, if you can browse their user, you can see what files. You don't have to see images. You don't have to see anything. You just see file names. And that's what they're sharing. And I thought about this in multiple ways. I was like, well, in the day, back in about 2005, 2006, I remember coming across the Cameroonian embassy for Britain accidentally sharing all their documents. They had loaded up, someone had loaded up this so they could download movies and music, but they were also sharing all of the official documents from the Cameroonian embassy. So I realized that loads of people didn't know how to use this, because when you actually set up the thing, it just says, if you go through it and just click next, you'll go past a bit that says, which folders do you want to share? And it automatically selects your downloads folder. And in your downloads folder is everything. Everybody just clicks download. So can you imagine if you could just go and look into someone's downloads folder, and you could see all of the list of all of the different things they're sharing. If they're sharing very bad stuff, you can also see the documents they're sharing, which include bills they've downloaded, includes all of their sort of CVs, things like that. And all you have to do then is note down the IP address and start downloading all of the documents. You get to see the person's name, address, all of their details. You're able to build it up. And then there was, that got to a point where it was like, okay, how can I use that then on other things? And that led to the Black Cube article where I was once.
Here it is.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Law 360, a company that sells access to court information in America and other information, so public databases, to official companies. Black Cube is a Israeli private intelligence Unit 8200 company, and they should have the best sort of protection when it comes down to their downloads and their documents. And what were they doing? One of the receptionists or administrators, I think she was actually a financial person for Law 360, was downloading music on one of these peer-to-peer platforms and sell it as sharing all of their documents, including their contracts, which showed that this Black Cube were buying information from Law 360 about loads of American details. And there was a few. I went through a few cases. I tried to also teach people and guide people how to do this themselves, so you could have people who look through this sort of stuff and report people who are doing really terrible stuff. But to be perfectly honest as well, it's extremely depressing. If you enter into that world, you've got to, at some point, you've got to decide, this is not my job. This is too. Yeah. I know it's possible to do, but it's also, people are not interested in it either, because even though people want to see people to be brought to justice, a lot of the time it's too much for them to take. And so it doesn't. I tried to use it in loads of different ways. I tried to use it the best I could, but then I ended up being like, I've got to stop doing that because it's
Yeah.
just going to depress me. It's
Yeah.
just going to make me sad all of the time, and it's going to make me like think about my past and
Yeah, right.
want And there's a lot of anger, a lot of things. You never really get over like abuse from your past. What you do is you learn to put it in boxes
Mhm.
and define and refine it. So those articles were really special. Some of it was really interesting. And when I come across what seemed like Ghislaine Maxwell sharing really dirty stuff, that was just bizarre. And it was going through the actual, you could find the IP address and you can locate where these people are sharing this stuff from. And this account that was under the name GHISL,
Amazing.
Gil, at the beginning of Ghislaine, was sharing via a Canadian TV or internet provider that's very, I can't remember what the company's called. And the guy who was running it and who was in the office of the building where this was going through, where this was being these stuff was being downloaded, was Brian Mulroney, who was a friend of Robert Bloody Maxwell. And it was like, what the hell have I just found? This was when Ghislaine Maxwell was in hiding. When she was found, she is 150 miles away from where this server was, and it seemed like I couldn't. It gave me a lot of pause for thought. But again, people are not so much interested in that sort of stuff. There was much better places for me to focus my journalism, and it's very random, takes a long time, and so it's one of the many methods though that you can develop to find information that you would not find in any other way, but still
Well,
it's subversive.
it's interesting that you have absolutely no obligation to do that, of course, as you know, and I understand that it would be personal, and I know it's super dark. I mean, there's podcasts that I have gone through where I'll listen to the same person over and over again, and they'll be right, they'll be right, and I can't take it because it's just too depressing, and I'm just like, I can't, at first I tell everybody, I'll listen to this, but it's just too much. I can't take it. But in this specific case, if you think about it, in our country, probably yours too, the government roughly spends half of all the money. So, last time I looked into it, basically all governments put together spent almost 50% of GDP. That was the budgets of all the governments. So think about that. All of the production of all of the people go to government, and pretty much people consent to government for a couple of reasons. They don't touch me or my stuff. Maybe give me a safety net, depending on your ideology. Pretty much everybody, and even me, and as an anarcho-capitalist, more or less, my one of my last two stumbling blocks were copyright and, protect the children. Who's going to
Mhm.
protect the children? So if you watch all these shows, every movie and TV show and everything about, even if they say like if it's a CIA thing that's bad, the people who figure it out are the CIA people who are good. They're geniuses. The FBI, the cops, they're all geniuses. And so if you're spending half the money of the world and you're nothing but genius good guys, and your number one job is to stop this stuff, and you're finding it and nobody's doing anything about it, that's that's a decision that somebody is making for
Yeah,
whatever
yeah, yeah.
reason, and you're
Hey,
what?
there's a decision being made at the
Yes.
moment. Look, I mean, really, we what we see with and again, this relates in a sense to like the outskirts of the cultural dark web, as the intellectual dark web, is that there is a real focus on trying to reduce people's anger when it comes to abuse, because there's so much of it about they're trying to, I think, including a lot of the transgender stuff. That stuff causes a lot of harm, and they seem to be systematizing it and making it so that it's not prosecutable. People who are doing terrible crimes are getting no prison time and are getting let off. There is an agenda at play. It's to reduce the anger that people feel towards people who are doing extremely bad stuff, especially to young people. And whether that's so that the people in power can get away with it more, or whether that's because, as one policeman told me, or policewoman told me, there's just way too much of it. You just don't, people do not realize how bad it actually is. And one of those data diving articles was me talking about statistics in that sense. And when I did some of the Epstein research for the One Nation Under Blackmail, like some of the stats when it comes to, especially when it comes to child abuse and stuff, are unbelievable. And you have to take it into the sort of context of things like when you've got the vaccine, when people tell you about officially report vaccine injury, it's only like less than 1% of people or something that actually report that they've been vaccine injured. So 99% of people don't report it. That is the same with abuse. And when you do the maths on that, that is insane. And you start to look around and you start to wonder how prevalent it is and how much is the agenda there to try and stop people from being prosecuted because it'll take up money.
Well, that's what they say, but it's more than that, because I think they want to restructure society, break up the foundational bonds of family. People who are traumatized as children are more vulnerable to either pathological behavior or cult associations, even if that's like a virtual kind of thing. And I've been reading this book into my show and like discussing it, Mass Control: Engineering Human Consciousness by Jim Keith. That's from 1999, but chapter 6, I actually took the YouTube video down because halfway through it, I'm reading the words, and it's from Alfred Kinsey's report back in the day. And I mean, it makes me like want to gag, but for the sake of truth, I did keep reading it, and it's on Rumble and stuff, but I took it off of YouTube. And he took his study from, he said it was like the American male, but a lot of his subjects were men who were in prison for sexually deviant behavior, predatory behavior. And then he said, he wrote a report that was actually a general population statistics. Like 95% of men have done things that would be considered sex crimes. 95% in 1953 of American men. Definitely not true. But the point was, and it did actually have this effect, a really broad intergenerational effect, where his argument was, you're calling this deviance, and you're making laws against it, but it's not deviance. It's actually the majority of people are doing this. Therefore, your laws need to be more accepting of this stuff, because we're here to protect to abhor deviance, but this isn't deviance. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. Child genital mutilation is crazy.
I've come across it a lot. I come across it a lot with the agenda. When I've been researching, my Black Hand series was about the start of the sort of satanic, like making it like bringing it into like the elite, making it cool to be into Satanism, having these satanic parties and doing all of these things. It's the reduction of morals. But also when, like, for instance, one of the articles I wrote in about 2018 was on Barbara Hewson, a famous UK human rights lawyer who went on TV in about 2012 2013 and basically said the age of consent should be reduced to about 13-14 years old, and people like Rolf Harris and Jimmy Savile really haven't been doing anything wrong. That's kind of the essence of what she said. She's dead now. She died of she was a force to be reckoned with. And I couldn't, and when you look at that and you look at the people who are entering that narrative in and given this platform, you wonder, who are they? And I went back through her family history and discovered she's from a long line of contrarians. She's from a long line of people who say the opposite of what is done, or do the opposite of what is done at the time. It's a really interesting trait that these families who are maybe disrupt the status quo are lifted up Very early on as well, her family was given estates in Ireland by Queen Elizabeth the First. But you're going back to the 1500s there, and they were noted as being destabilizers and were as a family, and were put into areas where they could destabilize. And then, like, the family fought alongside the Catholics when against the Protestants when they were Protestant in Ireland and stuff like that. You know, they do the opposite over and over again. This is something that comes out in people's character, and that means that if there's a society, if society opposes a certain thing, like sex crimes, whether it be against women, men, or children, that's something that these people will then be leaning towards covering or focusing in on, because they're contrarian. They want to do whatever the opposite of society is doing because they want an argument and they want a fight. And they are the ones who are recruited to speak on behalf of these other people who want to do nefarious stuff but don't want their faces to be seen.
If you connect it with the Satanism, they're like inversionists, right? The Satan, they invert things. I missed your Black Hand series, and I just did like 3 or 4 shows on, not deep stuff like you do, but on Son of Sam, on Satanism and social control. I have such a stack of books. And actually, I tell the people this every time. I bought this crucifix and wear it because I was reading Anatomy of Witchcraft in bed, and I was like, I can't read these books on Satan without some protection. And it said like they don't like the crucifix, so I'm all of that. So I want to read that, and if when you have time, I want you to come back and talk about that if you wouldn't mind. But I don't want to take a lot of your time. I wanted to ask you about one more article, and then ask you about what you're up to. Do you have time for one more? Just one more?
No, I have loads of time, but however much time you want.
Take it to the bottom of the hour. So the last article I was looking at, the Welcome Five, I have been puzzling. I didn't try to find out, but I didn't think it would even be possible, would not know where to begin as who were masterminding the global COVID policies from the beginning. And man, you actually, like, who is they? You actually nailed the they in that case. I mean, the Welcome Five. I mean, how did you even begin to figure that out? I mean, you knew someone was behind it.
There's like trying to unwrap COVID during COVID was really difficult, and I have to say there's an even greater they that I go into, which I haven't released this article yet. There's an actual article that I've been writing over a period of 2 years that goes back even further and looks at someone who may well be the great-grandfather or great-grandfather of Jeremy Farrar and his involvement with vaccinations in the 1800s and early 1900s, and virus research. There's trying to find out who is involved in what. I wanted to understand the British side. I wanted to understand the proximal origin paper. That was obviously the thing that was really central to the issue of COVID, to the lockdowns, and to backing up this zoonotic spread idea for the virus, rather than it being from a laboratory. And that was the crux. Is it from a laboratory? Yes, it's from a laboratory. It's not. They were showing you loads of images on TV of squids in wet markets and pangolins and whatnot. And they're really taking the mick. They're taking the mickey, as we say. I'm sure that there was something wrong there. So instantly, my first thought is, let's look at the people who wrote the proximal origin paper, and let's start to break down their connections. And from there, I really, first of all, because anybody who knows a little bit about movie history, if you look at the cover for Welcome Five, is actually a version of the Ocean's 11 original Rat Pack Ocean's 11 cover. Because originally it was going to be called the Welcome 11, and it was going to be, but to be perfectly honest, like I could have gone on forever. I could have gone past 11. When you get to 11, you're like, oh, well, these people are all definitely involved. They're all definitely important. But I really wanted to focus in proximal origin paper. Who organized it, who wrote it, and the more you looked into it, the more you look at the things like the Buzz News feed leaks, however they were referred to, that gave us some of the emails backwards and forwards between Fauci and others, you start to realize that Fauci and Whitty were both saying, right, we need to go through Jeremy Farrar for everything. And Jeremy Farrar's the central point of planning for all of this, for the proximal origin paper and for what lockdowns will look like. And the main advice will come from Jeremy Farrar. So who is Jeremy Farrar? Well, Jeremy Farrar was the head of the Wellcome Trust, and that's such a strange organization in itself. There was a temptation to start to go back to, I think it's Henry Wellcome, the person who created the Wellcome Trust, because it's such a long story. It's so interesting. Their archives are extremely interesting, but as a not-for-profit, non-governmental style pharmaceutical kind of organization, or medical organization, it's like the second biggest in the world.
Yeah, it says it's the fourth wealthiest charitable foundation in the world, not just about health raising. The fourth largest, wealthiest charitable foundation in the world. That shapes the world. That stuff, I've read a lot about tax-exempt foundations and the problems with them. This is bigger than anything that I've stumbled upon, I think.
Amazing. They're an enormous entity. And how did that become? I couldn't understand how something that isn't connected has no accountability to the people. That's one of the main points, is that when you look at it, you're like, wait a minute, they've put it across to these people who are not accountable to the public at all. And that's not right. That's instantly a sign that that's the establishment at work. So how do the establishment communicate with the Wellcome Trust? Well, it's backdoor meetings in the Royal Society, and who's the Royal Society? And there was so many questions. So I've decided to go back to the start. What I did at first was I started to look at Jeremy Farrar, his birth and his rise. Now, one thing that's interesting about Farrar, and if you want to see a glimpse into the article that's coming into the future, like a little glimpse, one of my first attempts at making sort of like a documentary movie around that was really as professional as I could make it, with a little soundtrack and everything, was back in about 2021, where I made this controller virus, and it looks as the Manchurian plague outbreak in 1910-1911, a point where Dr. Wu, who put on the seminar that was held in China, created the N95 masks and stuff like this, and it was a really interesting. It was attended, but the British sent a certain man. They sent a guy called Reginald Anstruther Farrar, and he has the same name, Farrar. And it made me go, wait one goddamn moment. I like ancestry. Is this guy related? Is this extremely powerful British person who's concentrating on vaccines and viruses in the late 1800s and early 1900s, who just happens to have the same name as the person and almost a significantly similar background, goes to study in India and Asia plagues, same as Jeremy Farrar did? And I said to myself, okay, look back in history of Jeremy Farrar. I get back to his father being born in 1917, Eric Farrar. His parents are meant to be in their mid-50s when he's born. That makes no sense whatsoever. The chance, there's 11 years in between. 11 years between their last child and this kid Eric Farrar. Now, at the same time, there's an extremely famous Reginald Anstruther Farrar's father is one of the chaplains to the Queen Victoria back in the day. So extremely important in the church hierarchy. And his brother Eric Farrar, also called Eric Farrar, was also, I think he was Archbishop of somewhere. He was quite big up in the church as well, and had a couple of like weird sort of like allegations of scandals in the background. And then you've got this kid, Eric Farrar, who's brought up by these, and I found it very interesting. I thought, okay, there's a lot to be found with Jeremy Farrar. So I made them separate stories, and the Welcome Five was an analysis. First, it was supposed to be a Jeremy Farrar, but once I worked out who Jeremy Farrar was, I looked at his recruitment, and his recruitment was through an Oxford Wellcome funded program in 1993, 1994, 1995 that was run by Edward C. Holmes, the guy who translates the first transcription of COVID into English on January the 11th, 2020. So he's an important part linked with Jeremy Farrar too. He recruits. He's in charge at that point of recruiting doctors in the 90s who are going to be funded by the Wellcome Trust, fully funded throughout their entire careers, to do whatever this big organization wants them to look into. And it turns out this is a regular thing. The Wellcome Trust goes in and recruits a load of the best doctors out of these best universities and puts them to work wherever they want to go. So Edward C. Holmes recruited Jeremy Farrar. That's very interesting. Who's running the Wellcome Trust at that point? Roy Anderson's running the Wellcome Trust. He actually has to stand down eventually from the Wellcome Trust, but is involved in foot and mouth disease crisis. One of his main, he's a mentor to one of his the most important people through COVID-19, which was Neil Ferguson, who, along with Roy Anderson, and Roy Anderson invented pandemic modeling, computer modeling. Really, he's the guy who pioneered it. That's really important. You know, how do we make up all our decisions? That guy over there created the model of how we create all of our. What's he doing? Oh, he's recruiting all of these different people who are going to be intimately involved in COVID-19. And they're all they seem to be managed by one guy, extremely well connected to one guy, a guy called Richard Sykes, who is an extremely important person in history. He was actually, for Britain, the whole COVID response, when they created the organization to head that was headed by Richard Sykes. And Richard Sykes was central to making what was originally Wellcome PLC into this Wellcome Trust. He was also instrumental in creating the infrastructure for how scientific data is shared and how it's seen as official or not, whether it's marked as being, you know, oh, we've checked this, yes, it's right, it's our people who were involved. And you know, it became clear that I had to really focus in on 5 people. It was actually 6 people. There was another one, Brian Spratt. And when I got to realizing that Brian Spratt was involved, Brian Spratt was the guy who did the inquiry into foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK, which Roy Anderson and Neil Ferguson took over and led to 8 million cattle being burnt all across the countries and lockdowns across the countryside in 2001 under Blair. Now, that whole period, that whole time, these people were really important. But Brian Spratt, he was massively important in a load of different things, in basically signing off a lot as no official interference in a load of the previous historical cases where Porton Down, the biological test facility for the Ministry of Defence, had sprayed the British public with loads of things like cadmium zinc sulfide, with E. coli and other things over a period of about 20, 30, 40 years, all documented, all admitted to. I found that before I could start the Welcome 5 article, I had to go away and do the first article, which was about that sort of era before Porton Down's ideological cloud, I called it. And it was about secret experiments that led up to that. And through focusing in, that article was about focusing in on the careers of each of these really important parts to COVID behind the scenes. These people were vitally important. Jeremy Farrar decided how everything was going to go. Richard Sykes rolled it out with the vaccine task force in the UK. Neil Ferguson was the one who put out the pandemic modelling saying millions, hundreds of millions would die. Edward C. Holmes is the man who's there transcribing it and going to get a Nobel Prize for doing so. You know, all of these people were really really involved in COVID and were not being talked about at all. And I felt like the whole thing was then, there was other people I included later on. You know, Pardis Sabeti was one of them, and some others who were really important to the development of this agenda that we see roll out. One of the interesting things that came from it was realizing how important the Royal Society was in the UK to organizing these things behind closed doors. They are not accountable. They are fundamentally the ones who are pulling the strings. It becomes clear that some of the members of the Royal Society are people we know very well. Even Elon Musk is an honorary member of the Royal Society.
Really?
Yes, he is. Along with people like David Attenborough is also there. And we see how they push agendas out. So when the more you study it, the more you realize, okay, there was a bigger story here. But for that article, it was clunky, to be honest. It's a 15,000 word article. So it's pretty much thick with data. Yeah. But I tried to simplify it by breaking it up into the individual pieces. And like I say, there's another story. Reginald Farrar and this Manchurian outbreak of pneumonic plague in 1910, 1911 is so important to the development of how the international community responded to vaccines, and then how they utilized their response to test out their prophylactics and remedies and vaccines on different people, including prisoners. So they all flocked to China. Reginald Anstruther Farrar was their head for the British delegation. A guy called Dr. Strong, who's working out of Manila for the Rockefellers, was selected again by the Rockefellers. I think it was Truman or somebody who said, he should be the one to represent us. Zabolotny of Russia was the Russian candidate to be sent over. One of the most important people in vaccine history. He's the guy who gave himself a TB vaccine and then gave himself tuberculosis and didn't die, and claimed that or at least that's what he claimed, and then went out and forced it upon all of the Russian population, which caused great consternation in Russia.
Yeah.
All of these people, there's Shibasabu, who was the Japanese entry, is one of the most evil men in history. There is no one more evil than him. He was, when the Japanese were in control of China, at one point, what they were doing were giving the Chinese plague, and they would block like an entire town, and they'd block it off, shoot anyone who tried to leave, and they'd watch what would happen. There was the people who were involved in that, their behavior of the past makes you realize, oh look, if you look at the future, they're just doing the same thing. Over 100 years on, they produced things during the Manchurian plague which were really interesting. Lockdowns. You had to have a certain color badge shown onto you if you wanted to pass from one area to another area. Train lines were closed off. Of that plague, 60,000 people died. Only 3 people survived. It was so horrific. But it's amazing. You look back in history, you discover that the same people connected to the same entities are still doing the same thing, but every generation forgets the last generation's experience.
It makes sense that it would be the actors would be intergenerationally connected like that, because I feel like there has to be a different mindset in that I mean, the only way I can get my mind around it is that they think that there are 2 kinds of people, like them, like people, and then that the rest of us are animals, so they don't have to feel bad about that, or they separate it out and say, well, it's for the greater good, which is like ridiculous, but they just don't see the divine spark in the human being. And actually, one of the few things that I just came across immediately when I looked up this Farrar is that I'm not a believer in the power of prayer, which is fine with me. I don't care, but that was like a thing that was top line for him, makes me think like this is a guy who is not thinking of human beings as having any
Oh
unique
yeah.
right to, be themselves. There's also here the Wellcome Trust. If you just Google Wellcome Trust and Tavistock, there's just a whole lot of things that they do together. So medical stuff, psych stuff, human relations stuff. I mean, I actually feel like just in preparing for our conversation, I realize, and I obviously don't have a time to read everything that I'd like to read. Normally, I don't even have the books there. I have a screen, but I was using the book, so I had to leave it down for a minute. But I would say your work is essential reading. All of it, everything that you've done, I would say is essential reading for any conspiracy researcher. I mean, it should be for everybody, but for people like me who don't have the smoking guns around stuff like, Mencius Mollbug, or, it started with Epstein. I remember I used to try to figure stuff out for Epstein, and your work, you're just you're just amazing at this deep research. It's really amazing. And how valuable, and I haven't found anything. I've never read any of your articles where I'm like, the real story is this, or that's not true, and he's got an agenda. I've never read an article of yours where I haven't thought it was just nothing but valuable. So I hope that you're going to keep doing that, and I want to know what you're up to right now, how you're
Mhm.
making a living to keep you working, and what your next projects are.
Well, I had to save up. Like with any, I don't. I have a Patreon. I have Ko-fi. I have no other money, no funding coming in. Even if I do write an article for another site, it doesn't really bring in a lot of revenue. And so at the moment, like when I was with TNT, that was useful because I was making money that can then support my journalism.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not so useful in the fact that I then have to, dedicate all my time to something a different type of journalism. But then I know that these things like come and go. So at the time, I just had to do a lot of saving up and put money to the side because I know that it's in what I do is an indulgent form of journalism. It doesn't pay the rent, but it needs to be done. But I'm from a working class family, grew up in very poorer areas. So when times need to be tight, times need to be tight. So anybody who can help me out, I love you very much. But really, what I'm doing at the moment is trying very hard to get to the nub of certain issues. I've got so many projects on, so many, unbelievable. Some of them are passions that have been going on for years. So I've been writing a Ripper book for about 4 years.
Jack the Ripper.
I know who
Jack the
Jack the
Ripper.
Ripper is.
Oh,
I know who
awesome.
Jack. There was no doubt. There is
It was
no
a
doubt at
psyop
all.
for sociological reasons, was it not?
Yeah,
To change shape society.
no,
Many things,
no,
maybe not?
no. It's. I mean, the true
Okay.
story is so completely enthralling, so completely makes sense from start to finish that once you've finished, like, looking at the evidence, you go, "Oh God, well, there you go. That's what actually happened,
Wow.
and
Oh my
that's who
gosh.
it
I
was."
can't wait. I'm
I
fascinated. Yeah,
mean, I one of
fascinated.
the some of the most interesting parts of the Ripper story are not published because people are wrapped up in the mystery of it, and that, you know, you've got, at some point you've got to get over the mystery and you've got to analyze everything evidence wise, and you start to see, oh, there's just one person who's just clearly
Wow.
the guy. So that, I mean, I've got another book that I can't really talk about that I've been working on for
Fine.
a couple of years as well. That's well, I can talk about it a bit. It's about Gloria Steinem, and it's the rise of feminism led by the CIA, and some of the things that just, I got
Yes, it's gonna
information
be
no
great.
one's got. It's a unbelievable story. I mean, I would say to any researcher, start going down that rabbit hole, and you'll find articles galore. It's very interesting. The Black Hand work,
Yes,
the
let's
Black
do
Hand
that now.
series,
That
I was
sounds
developing that into a book already because I got so much more information, and it really leads to the downfall of the British government and the attempt to blackmail JFK, but also is the rise of the satanic parties, you know, the Man in the Mask parties. That's where these were all kind of mapped out, and it's a really interesting story. It starts with the death of multiple nightclub girls over a year and a half period, and all those nightclubs are taken over by gangsters and intelligence mobsters who are merging, are synthesizing at the time, and becoming basically the same unit. You know, when you hear lots of people say, "Oh, JFK was assassinated by the mob" and other things, it's
mhm.
that by this point the intelligence and the mob were basically indistinguishable from each other, because
I was just saying
intelligence,
that yesterday. Yeah.
yeah,
I
they
was
were recruiting from the mob. I mean,
the
intelligence were looking for people who could do subversive activities, and the
yeah.
mob's the perfect recruiting ground.
There's a dock worker strike, and the guy who's running it is supposedly mobbed up. I'm like, "Oh, that just means it's an intelligence operation."
That is, yeah, that would, I mean, most of the time that would lead you to, with when you have those sort of ideas, go look for the information, go look for a
Yes,
bit of evidence, and you'll be like,
yes.
oh, rabbit hole, and you'll find something else which will be the story. Article wise, I'm really I mean, I've got some really interesting projects which are like media projects going, some of them which are a little bit funny. So one relating to the Black Hand series, I'm actually developing. Hod Dibbin, who created the Pygmalion girl, the idea of a sex slave that you could control to use with the elites to compromise them, and created the Man in the Mask parties, the original person to put them on, well documented. Well, Horace Dibbin's Time Traveling Adventures is something I've been working on, along with the Jeffrey Epstein podcast, but those are just like things for fun to work on. Article wise, I've got some really important. I got one that's partially to do with the Wef and Schwab stuff. It's on Benazir Bhutto, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the Pakistan and Indian nuclear programs, and there's things behind that no one really knows. It's very interesting. She also linked with a lot of the same people who were mentoring Schwab, were also asked to mentor her. She went to Harvard. It's a very interesting story in itself. The Reginald and Strufer Farrar article is almost at the end. So, but that is a beast of an article that leads to other places. I got an article coming out very soon. I'm looking for the right time to release it. I was going to release it during the Labour Party conference, but then the Eric Weinstein piece came up, and it was too tempting to put that out. So I got an article called Blair and Clinton, the third way. It's about third way politics. It's about how nearly all of the British establishment of New Labour, Yvette Cooper, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband, Ed Balls, they were all trained via people like Robert Reich, Larry Summers through Harvard. They were involved in the Clinton campaign in 1992. They were all studying under Clinton, even when Clinton was meeting Jeffrey Epstein loads and etc. And it's really how the includes leadership courses that Brown and Blair went through that were American deep state leadership courses that originally come from Rockefeller funded creation, basically how the CIA and the American liberal establishment helped to push forward third way politics and created New Labour to mimic New Democrats, and how then it was all a plan to enact a form of globalism that would use the third way politics to get to that agenda, where third way politics basically pushes out the left and the right, purges the left and the rights of parties, and then replaces the lack of policy that you can choose from the left and the right. It replaces it with war and austerity, and that's what we've seen over and over again. And so that article is extremely important to me. So I got to find the right time to bring that out. I got loads of stuff I'm constantly working on. People constantly bring me stuff that is really interesting, but I might not have the time for. Whatever happens, like, I'm always on the lookout for something that's going to spark and take me down a rabbit hole.
Two things for you. There's something called the New Pluralists, which I think is also maybe a later gen of the Rockefeller thing. You might want to check that out, newpluralist.org. And so I'm looking, I just want people to, I want to mention, I think Newspaste is probably newspaste.com seems to me the easiest to get all of your articles, podcasts, how to support you. I love that you have this little thing, give the author a year of WordPress.com. That's fantastic. That's a really great way to contribute. I try to encourage people to support my guests because you're bringing all this information. So I don't ask for much myself. I just need to pay for my producer because I'm not doing this on my own. So I have commercials and everything, but I encourage people to go to newspace.com and contribute to Johnny's work. And yeah. And is there anything else you want to tell the people?
Well, so
much else.
Yeah, there's always something. I mean, I'm back up on the podcast at the moment. So Newspace podcast is
that's here. Yep.
Yeah, and it's going to be out every week. Got some really, I've made a lot of contacts through TNT, so I got some really interesting things to discuss. But the point of what we were talking today should not be missed. For all of the people who are listening at home, who are interested in this sort of stuff, understand that there's techniques and ways for you yourself to become active, because all I am is active. I put down things in chronological order, and I try and give people a better understanding of situations. If you go out and you use these sort of techniques, and you use things like archive.org and different newspaper archives and stuff, it's as simple as looking for something that you're angry about or you're passionate about and discovering about it yourself, and then looking around and realizing that the majority of things, that information you find, it will actually be interesting to people, and it's not out there. Things are being lost to history. That's how it works. History, the sands cover everything, and we forget. We end up with just a statue of Ozymandias, King of Kings. So what we got to do is this is a joint exploration. This is a human exploration. This isn't about me, and this isn't about my work alone. Please get involved. Look at my work. work, and I say to look at my work, a lot of the time I'm telling people, go read my articles and think about how an article should be designed, then go to the mainstream and look at how they design an article, and understand that you know what you have to do is put in as much information in as short form as you can. And you out there, all of you, could be your own journalists. It doesn't even have to be big journalism nowadays. You don't have to write 7,500 or 15,000 word
Right.
articles. You can write a 500 word post that gets a little bit of information out, that helps people like me, helps other journalists, but helps yourself to develop at the same time. So we should all be involved in this. The process of information is being destroyed. If you think you find information, or you think you know where to look for information that could be destroyed, keep it alive. That's what we're meant to be doing. The future is if it's designed by the people who are currently designing it, is a dark place where we get no information at all, and we really need to save whatever is out there. So we need to work together in that sense. Even if you think you're not doing much, you know, if I'm looking for information and I stumble across something someone's posted, and it's really and this has happened many times, it may not seem important to that person, too important to that person at the time, but it could be the very crux to prove the point of what I'm doing or what someone else is doing. So it doesn't matter whether or not you're an actual journalist. It's time to start journaling. It's time. Information is being destroyed.
And I do agree with you that if it's interesting to you, even if it seems like it would have no interest to other people, it's always interesting to other people. If you're going down that rabbit hole, and that's definitely how I put together even just my daily show. If I'm reading the article to the end and taking notes about it, I'm sharing that. I don't care if it's about
Mhm.
chicks on cargo ships or what. I'm gonna not that interesting, but it was it. You know, at the end of it, you can figure something out. Why is this article here? And you get
Mhm.
that one insight, which I will leave. I will close with this to emphasize your point. John Taylor Gatto, who's a great educator, and he was a teacher of the year many times, and he was a real he really cared about the truth of things, and he was right about deep history and everything, and you would just want to hear his history of education and children and orphanages and everything. But he said, don't forget to read fiction. He said, because
Mhm.
any good work of fiction, it offers it would be great. A great work of fiction offers one original insight about human nature, perhaps. One original insight makes is imbues greatness to a work, and you have to do it. So I always think just one if you had one thing, you have really accomplished something. And boy, have you added many one things. I'm really blown away by the quality of your work. It's really amazing. It's just amazing.
Lovely.
So
Thank you.
thank you for doing it, and thank you for spending your time. It's later for you than it is for me.
Mhm.
I'm encroaching on your Friday night, although
It's fine.
your Friday night is Saturday morning probably, 'cause,
No, I'm gonna be going on another podcast later, and I'll be maybe two podcasts. So I'll be having a nice Friday night of talking with people about stuff like this. So that's good enough for me. I'm happy.
well, it's super fun. I'm gonna say goodbye to you, but I'm gonna ask you to hang on because I wanna make sure I have your local recording. That was really the great Johnny Vedmore. Thank you all for listening, and see you next time. This is Monica Perez.